Hello and welcome to the Nope Coach podcast. I'm your host, Suzanne Culberg. This is episode 308. In true Nope Coach form, it has a no in the title. You have the right to say no in the birth room with Angie Evans. So I don't normally do an introduction, but I'm going to give you a tiny bit of context for this because you might be like, hey, what? Angie is a birth doula and we've connected a number of years ago. And some of the things that we talk about when we're just chatting, business coffee cuppa thing, is advocating for self or advocating for your needs or what is and isn't allowed in the birth space. I personally had a very traumatic birth with my first child. My second one was a lot better. I didn't really know what a doula was. So for anyone listening, my friend hired a doula when I was pregnant with Xanthi, and I was like, what is that? I hadn't come across the term. So a person to support you through the birth. There's different types of doulas, but the birth doula. And I remember thinking, so if you're listening to this thinking, why would you want that? I honestly thought that too. Sorry, Angie, I'm nothing if not honest. I was like, what would you need that for? Isn't that what the midwives are? I had no context. And sometimes you have no context until you go through an experience. And then after I had Xanthi, I was like, oh, so I hired a doula for Casimir's birth. And then in Australia, at least at that time, I don't know, I think you and I have talked in Canada is different. Angie's from Canada. If you have a cesarean, you're only allowed one support person in. So obviously it was Jeremy. So my doula didn't actually get to come in for the birth, which was sad, but she was still a great support leading up to it, working through a lot of the stuff that had happened and a lot of the things I was carrying post Xanthi. And also she came to visit us, and different doulas work differently. But when we first went home to meet Casimir and debrief, so it was still very beneficial to have her, even though she wasn't in the birth room, which is technically her role, if you look at it, So with all that being said, Angie, where do you want to start? When you talk to people, would you want to, because you said, you have the right to say no in the birth room. First time mums, repeat mums, any mums, where are we starting this conversation?
Well, for anyone, I teach prenatal classes, and every class I teach actually has something about how to advocate for yourselves, how to make informed choices. And one thing I say is that people have the same rights in the birth room as they do in the coffee shop. So imagine someone walking up to you in the coffee shop and saying, open your legs, I'm going to put my hands in you. Or here, you need to drink this type of tea. Or you can imagine all the scenarios. And in a coffee shop, we'd be like, well, screw you. All right. This is my body. But in the birth room, people just don't. There are a few factors here. One is that the main one, so the starting place, is people don't know they can say no. People don't know they are actually meant to be an active participant and make choices in the birth room. I've even had people who work in birth units attend my prenatal classes and say, what? That's optional. So the people who work there sometimes might not know that something's optional.
I love how you compare it to a coffee shop, because there is context. If it was ever even considered, someone's like, I'm just going to stick something up here in a coffee shop, you would be like, what? This is newsworthy. Obviously context in the birth room, but the fact that instead of saying, I'm going to do this to you, this is an option, or are you open to? I remember when I had Xanthi, I was adamant I did not want a epidural. Everyone's different, and I did not want one. And my blood pressure spiked and all this sort of stuff. And basically it was pretty much overridden. I wasn't forced, but it wasn't far off. And no other option was discussed. And I think sometimes we can get waylaid into things that we don't want to do, because railroaded, probably a better term. Oh. So I guess for the online classes, because your online classes, they're for anyone around the world can attend those, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And would you recommend them for people for a subsequent birth? Because that's another thing too. I never even considered classes for Casimir because I already had a baby. So if anyone's listening to this and he's like, actually, I didn't have a great time the first time, would it be beneficial for them to attend a class?
Yes. So I do get mostly first timers, because having your first baby, go do prenatal classes. But especially for people who are my doula clients, I ask them to do the classes and they get a whole different perspective because they've already been there, done that, and they want to do it differently. Like, I mean, a lot of people who don't wish to repeat how their first birth went. There are exceptions, of course, but and for them to just sit there and listen about like all the choices they have that they can make, and also how to make those choices, how to get the information, because I don't think it's smart to just go in and say, I'm going to say no to everything. Nobody's going to do anything to me. And it's also not smart to just go in and say, I'm just going to do what I'm told and not ask questions. Like there is a middle ground. And I like to see people who know how to ask the questions, know how to get the information. I love the term shared decision making instead of
Yes.
informed consent, right? Because informed consent kind of implies we're just going to keep bugging you till you say yes. And a lot of people feel quite coerced, and they do finish their birth feeling like something was done to them. Shared decision making includes people's wishes and dreams and fears, their medical situation, their medical history, and it also includes the wise counsel of the medical people around them who have lots of education and experience. And so we put all of that together and then have shared decision making. And I've worked with people who had births that are completely different than what they thought and completely different than what their ideal birth was. I've also worked with people who had exactly what they wanted. But at the end of the day, it's how someone was treated that is the biggest difference. I've worked with people who had like so many check marks that they didn't think that would be a check mark on their list. And they felt really great about their birth because they understood why things were happening the way they were, and they were part of the decision-making process.
That all of that, like I could just listen to that again because it's so healing to be part of the decision making process rather than informed consent. Well, this is what I'm going to do to you, okay? When I had Xanthi and we ended up with an emergency cesarean, I remember the piece of paper they gave me to sign, and they're reading out the things that could go wrong, which is part of informed consent. I may have been drugged up to the nines, and I may have been of a lot of stuff happening, but I remember distinctly that they did not say hysterectomy was a risk. And I went to medical school. I should know that. But anyway, I'm reading the form mid labor and stuff. And I can still remember, and Jeremy still talks about this to this day, how I ripped into them because they didn't say hysterectomy, but it was written on the form, and they're asking me to sign something. And anyway, like, it's called informed consent. And Jeremy's like, can you just sign the paper already? But I didn't feel heard. I didn't feel considered. I didn't feel like I actually mattered. And it was my birth.
There's way too much of that going around. Yeah.
Or like sometimes I had a friend who was talked into a cesarean, not because of anything else, but the doctor wanted to get to a golf game. Now I understand that people have stuff outside of it, and doctors and nurses and doulas and midwives are working. I'm not saying any of those sorts of things, but a procedure to my body because the timing's more convenient for you when this actually isn't what I want at all. Like I'm not knocking people who want a cesarean and advocating for it, like all this sort of stuff. I wished I had advocated harder. When I had Xanthi, I'm pretty intuitive. I had an inkling it wasn't going to go well. So I actually asked for a cesarean at the very beginning, and that was denied. So talking about shared decision making, they're like, no, we do a trial of labor for 8 hours and then 22 hours later. So much for this trial of labor. But it was like, yeah. So anyway, all that to say, when people are, what do you recommend? So if they don't have a doula, but they've, I'm sure you cover this in the classes, but they have a birth plan or they have this, because I loved how you said, I'd have to listen back to it, but you're like, it doesn't mean you say no to everything and you're staunch. And it's like this checklist or nothing. But how do you recommend that they advocate to say, can you explain this to me further? Or what are my options? Or this is what I prefer. So they at least feel heard in the process.
It's hard because, and I mean, that might be a whole other episode, but why it's hard to speak up with different hormones and stress responses and whatnot. Like that's a whole can of worms. The first thing is before the birth, figuring out what people want, what they want, and also finding out what is the normal at the place where they're going to give birth. In some places, it's just expected that people will have an IV and have certain medications and be on a timer. And then in other places, it's not like that at all. And different practitioners, and around the world, there are many places where midwives are more the primary caregivers. Where I live in North America, it's mostly obstetricians and fewer people have midwives. So that's something, is how do they work? Now, most practitioners have to follow the same guidelines. Like in Canada, everyone, whether they're nurses, doctors, midwives, have to follow the same guidelines. So you're going to be offered the same things, but just learning how do people work. And then in some areas, it's like you said, where someone might rush the process because they want to go home. And that makes sense in a way. A lot of other areas now have, well, if you haven't had your baby by 6 p.m., there's a shift change. So that makes it a little bit, it's good and bad. It's good because you don't get rushed as much, but then you're learning, like meeting new people along the way. So to just back it up and find out what are the local policies, what do I want, learning what the options are. And then in the birth room, it is so important to have a strong advocate. And that could be a partner who isn't afraid to speak up. I would say if someone doesn't have a partner who isn't afraid to speak up, then they need to bring someone in, whether that's a feisty sister or a friend or a doula. There's so much research showing the benefits of having doulas. Half the rate of cesareans, 60% fewer requests for pain medication, significantly shorter labors, more comfortable, i.e. less painful labors. And interesting, heterosexual couples have significantly more eye contact and touch between them when there's a doula in the room. So we support partners too, and then that kind of allows everyone. The other thing is to just pause. Like we have all these acronyms, brains, like what are the benefits, risks, alternatives, da 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 da. But even just to say, wait, I have questions. Some people write on their birth plan, I'm going to ask questions. I think birth plans are really important, but they need to be what's unique to you. And really, honestly, the best birth plan would be, do not touch me or do anything until you have my expressed verbal consent, and I will ask questions so I can make informed choices. Now, I've worked in several different hospitals and birth centers, and across the board, I have seen people get their questions answered. I think the problem is more that people don't know they can ask questions, and they don't know that they have the right to say no. And certainly there is way too much coercion that goes on. And that's where we need someone with us who isn't afraid to say, wait, she doesn't consent to this. Even the phrase, I don't consent, that's very powerful. In any land, that is a powerful statement.
I love exactly all of that, and I encourage people to re-listen. The biggest part too that I want to bring highlight to is find out about your place, the place that you're delivering at. See, when I had Xanthi, we were supposed to have her at one hospital, but then there was some complications, so we ended up going to a different hospital. And there were things that were different, like they didn't have a pool, and I didn't know, I'd never been told that they would monitor her, like put a little clip on her head. So that kind of freaked me out. Nobody explained it. They didn't have, like in the place I was supposed to have her at, they had a docking station. So I literally just took my phone, and the other place was like, we don't have that. You need to have a CD or whatever it was back then. So the things, asking the question about, and also you don't know what you don't know. So having, as you said, the person to advocate, like whether it be a doula or something, or coming to a class, you can find out what kind of questions there are to ask, because sometimes the informed consent becomes coercion inadvertently because you don't know that there is another option. And I understand the staff could be really busy and have lots of other births on, and you're not the only person there. I'm not downplaying or wanting to make wrong people doing the best they can, but you know, when you know better that you can do better, and when you can ask and say, hey, is this an option, or I don't consent to that. Because then I remember when I had Casimir, I had a planned cesarean, whole long story, but I remember asking the surgeon, these are the things that I want. And I can still remember to this day him saying to me, I'm going to begin now, because I wanted to know, when you start open up my body, I want to know, you know. And the midwife's like, what are you doing? It's like, this is what Suzanne asked for. And everything, lowering the curtain so I could see all the things I didn't get the first time around. Like, they just whisked her off. I didn't know if she was a boy or a girl. Like, I was like, I want it baby lifted straight to me so I can see. I want my husband to cut the cord. Like, it was a different experience. It wasn't as rushed, but I didn't know to ask for these things, and because I didn't know they wouldn't have them the first time. So Angie, if people are listening to this, it's like, wow, these are things I'd never considered. And they're either pregnant themselves or they have a friend who's pregnant and want to know more about your classes, where can they find them?
Online. So I teach my classes in Zoom groups where people can actually ask questions. That's my favorite way to teach. I do have them on demand as well. And I do offer replays if someone misses a class or it's a weird time zone or something like that. And my website is my name, angieevans.ca, and that's ANGIEEVANS. So there's 2 E's in the middle, and then .ca for Canada. Yeah.
Lovely. I really highly recommend that you do on demand or live, have the ability to ask the questions. Even if you're not in Canada itself, there'll be enough universal stuff that you can get that knowledge. And then Angie will direct you to ask in your local center. These are the questions to ask, or these are things, because there are some slight differences. But yeah, because the other thing too, when I was pregnant myself, I went to the hospital that I was thinking I was going to deliver at, and everything was taught through that lens. Then when we ended up delivering in a different hospital, I never knew these things to ask because this wasn't the plan. And we all know births don't often go according to plan. Sometimes they do, but yeah. So if you have a more not location non-specific training, I think it will give you a richer experience to be able to ask these kind of questions so that you can say no in the birth room.
That is true. Yeah. And my website has just so many articles and so much information and links to my socials with all kinds of nuggets, just even for people who just want to learn a little bit more.
I love
Yeah.
it.
Whether they sign up for classes or not. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me, Angie. Thank you
Yeah.
everyone for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next one. Bye for now.
Thanks.